One of the sites we visited during the excursion of the World Neolithic Congress was the site of Çakmaktepe. Now, this is a site west of Sayburj that I actually knew very little about. It's received a lot less publicity than some of the other Taştepeler sites. It turns out that it occupies kind of a windswept hill, and it has a much less depth of deposition than the other sites. In fact, the remains are very shallow. So that makes it easy to get fairly wide exposures of the architecture without having to remove a lot of sediment. Of course, that also means there's less preservation, but it's still an extremely interesting site, and I think you'll agree with me that it helps us understand these sites a lot better. After we boarded the buses at Sayburj, we only had to travel a short distance west along the highway before turning south along some very rural roads and then up a steep hill of the Fatih Mountains, where the buses parked. Then we had to walk the rest of the way across the windswept hilltop, about 300 meters northwest toward the excavations, which had started in 2021. Directing the excavations are Professor Fatma Şahin from the Çukurova University in Turkey and Professor Dr. Yutaka Miyake of the University of Tsukuba in Japan. This site is fairly small, probably less than 2 hectares, and very shallow. One of the first things we came across was the bedrock floor of an oval plan building about 16 meters across with post holes around the periphery. This building 10, though a few centuries older than the more famous Taştepeler sites, such as Göbekli Tepe, already exhibits the familiar round plan, but presumably had many wooden posts instead of the famous T-shaped stone pillars. However, that's not to say that the people who occupied this site were unfamiliar with carving limestone. As in the other Taştepeler sites, the floors of the buildings at this site are actually cut down into the bedrock, technically making them semi-subterranean, or pit houses. In addition to the holes cut in the bedrock, there are also numerous cut marks. Although this large oval building was not the only building of that type, most of the other buildings are smaller and sometimes more irregular in plan. Building 4 in area G7, for example, has a nearly pentagonal plan subdivided by low stone walls into several irregular spaces. Most of the smaller buildings were roughly circular, 4 or 5 meters in diameter, with low stone walls on the perimeter and presumably a superstructure built of wood and other perishable materials. Again, these seem to have been semi-subterranean and often show cut marks in their bedrock floors, perhaps for breaking nuts or something like that. In some ways, these are similar to the round buildings that occur at some Natufian late Epipaleolithic sites in the southern Levant, such as Ain Malaha or Ainan in northern Israel, shown here. They're also a little similar to the round buildings at the early Neolithic site of Halan Chemi, some 230 kilometers to the east of this site. Other grinding equipment also appears in some of the buildings, including the probable mortar shown here. However, the floors were mostly devoid of artifacts, with most of the artifacts reportedly found in the post-occupation fill. Dr. Şahin and Miyake infer that all these buildings were intentionally filled in when they were abandoned. They note that rows of stones were often laid down as part of this fill. While walking around the excavation areas, I couldn't help but notice that there was a very high density of lithics on the ground, including both unretouched flakes and occasional tools. The quality of all this flint is excellent, very fine-grained and with very attractive red and brown colors. Reportedly, the flint comes from 2 nearby sources. One large flake I picked up had a very strong patina on its dorsal flake scars and much less patina on the ventral surface, leading me to suspect that it may have been struck by the site's Neolithic inhabitants from a much older Paleolithic core that they had picked up in the vicinity. Otherwise, all of the artifacts at this site point to a date in the early Pre-Pottery Neolithic A, or perhaps even the late Epipaleolithic, making the site a predecessor to sites like Karahan Tepe and Göbekli Tepe, and much earlier than nearby Sayburj. The lithic assemblage includes awls and drills, projectile points of both Nemric and Khiamian types, lunates or crescents reminiscent of the late Epipaleolithic, and sickle elements that indicate that the site's inhabitants were likely both hunting and harvesting wild cereals. Stone adzes at the site, meanwhile, could have been used to cut and trim the posts set into the post holes, or perhaps even to shape some of the limestone blocks seen at the site. Interestingly, the excavators found skulls of aurochsen, or wild cattle, wild sheep, and onagers, or wild donkeys, at the bases of the walls of Building 15, a large oval structure similar to Building 10, and apparently placed there deliberately after first being burned at some other location. Other faunal remains from the site include aurochsen, wild boar, gazelles, and rabbits, and it's possible that many of these, especially the gazelles, were hunted with the so-called desert kites that occur in large numbers in this region. These are funnel-like arrangements of stones used to steer the animals into traps where hunters awaited them. Another interesting feature was a sort of stone box on the southern periphery of Building 10. It's about 1.5 meters in width and of uncertain function. The excavators also found quite a few colored stone beads and fragments of stone vessels, a conical stamp, perhaps used for stamping an ink design on hide or textile, and one unusual shaft straightener, decorated with what might be a hunting scene. It shows 3 running animals, possibly gazelles. Surveys have indicated that there are many early Neolithic settlements in the vicinity of Çakmaktepe, in addition to those desert kites I mentioned. One of the things that makes this site so important is that it helps to document a somewhat gradual development from simpler round structures cut into bedrock but with wooden posts and superstructures to the more spectacular round structures with massive T-pillars at sites like Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe. In other words, those sites did not just suddenly arise out of a vacuum. As our site visit drew to a close, we wandered back toward the buses so we could head to our next destination, the famous Göbekli Tepe.